The headlights of my car cut through the inky darkness of Route 13 as I sped down the empty road, my heart pounding in my chest. The rearview mirror reflected a solitary figure, a man standing still at the roadside. His face was obscured by the night, but his eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to pierce through the glass, locking onto mine. And then, as I slammed on the brakes to offer him a ride, he vanished. The road less traveled. It was nearly midnight when I found myself on Route 13. The old highway had a reputation, a dark, forgotten stretch of asphalt that snaked its way through the dense forest, cutting through small, nearly deserted towns where the echoes of the past lingered like ghosts. Most people avoided the route, opting for the faster, more populated highways that wound around the nearby hills. But on that night, I had no choice. I had just wrapped up a business trip in a town that I couldn't even recall the name of. My phone had died hours ago, and there was no sign of any civilization in sight. My car hummed along the road, tires crackling over the gravel as the miles of endless trees blurred into an indistinguishable smear of darkness. The faint glow of my dashboard was the only light that seemed to guide me through the dense black void ahead. I had been driving for what seemed like hours when I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dim headlights, a faint silhouette of a man standing by the roadside. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the brake as I drew closer. His posture was odd, stiff, unmoving, as if he had been waiting there for an eternity. As my car approached, the wind whispered through the trees, sending an eerie chill down my spine. I couldn't see his face. His features were lost in the darkness, cloaked by the shadow of the road. Yet something about him, something subtle but unsettling, told me he wasn't just any traveler in need of a ride. The car slowed as I neared him, my hand hesitating over the door handle. I knew better than to pick up strangers on deserted highways, but there was something about the way he stood, as if rooted to the earth, that paralyzed me with a strange sense of obligation. Maybe it was the emptiness of the road. Maybe it was the loneliness that had followed me all day. Whatever it was, I couldn't just drive past him. I rolled down the passenger window slightly, trying to make out any details of the man's appearance. His clothes were ragged, and his hair was long and matted, hanging in messy strands. But it was his eyes, dark, hollow, and fixed directly on me, that sent a shock of icy terror coursing through my veins. "Need a ride?" I called out, though my voice trembled despite my attempt at calm. The man didn't answer, only continued to stare. His expression was unreadable, but there was something undeniably wrong about his stillness. Just as I was about to roll up the window and continue on, he took a step forward. Without thinking, I unlocked the door. As soon as the man slid into the passenger seat, the air in the car grew thick, as if the very atmosphere had changed. He didn't say a word. He didn't even adjust himself, merely sat there, his eyes still locked forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't human, not entirely. His presence was too still, too unnatural, like a specter more than a living person. "You heading to the next town?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "It's still a few miles away." He didn't respond. I glanced over at him, noting his ragged clothes, a long coat that seemed out of place for the season, faded and torn in places. His hands, though, were the most disturbing. They were impossibly pale, with fingers that looked almost too long, too slender, as if they were made of wax, delicate and fragile. They rested unnaturally still on his lap. My eyes darted back to the road. Something about him made my pulse quicken, a knot tightening in my stomach. It was as though he was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something. We passed an old, rotting sign that read, "Welcome to Woodbridge," the last town for miles. The headlights illuminated the faded buildings on either side of the road. The town felt dead, abandoned, the kind of place that once had life but had been swallowed by time and neglect. And yet, it felt as though something was watching, hidden in the shadows. I glanced at him again, just to make sure he was still there. His face was now visible, pale and gaunt. His skin looked unnaturally smooth, as if he had never seen the sun. His eyes were the worst part, dark, endless pits that seemed to devour the light around them. I couldn't tear my gaze away. Suddenly he spoke. His voice was low, raspy, like it had not been used in years. "I've been waiting for you." My heart stopped. "What?" I stammered, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" His head tilted slightly, his gaze still locked onto me. "The road, it leads to something. Something you won't be able to escape." Before I could respond, the temperature in the car seemed to plummet. A cold draft blew through the cracked window, though I hadn't rolled it down. The man's eyes glistened, his lips barely parting as though he was about to say something more, but no words came. The car's engine sputtered for a moment, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my brow. The road ahead seemed to twist unnaturally, the trees becoming more dense, more suffocating. A strange hum filled the air, like the static noise before a radio turns to nothing but dead air. I wanted to scream, to pull over and drive away, but I couldn't. My body had frozen, as if the man's presence had paralyzed me. We continued driving for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly before us. The man remained silent, his cold eyes fixed ahead. I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. Every time I glanced at him, I saw something new. His face was changing, distorting, as if the shadows themselves were warping his features. Suddenly, the car lurched forward. I gripped the wheel tightly as the engine stalled again, the headlights flickering. The man's face was now different, almost unrecognizable, his features melting together like a grotesque mask. His mouth curled into a grin, his teeth sharp and jagged. "You should have never picked me up," he whispered, his voice now a low, guttural growl. I slammed the brakes, pulling the car to a screeching halt. My heart pounded in my chest as I desperately tried to start the engine, but it refused to turn over. The world outside seemed to fade, swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. I was trapped. The man's grin widened, stretching unnaturally across his face. His eyes, those dark, hollow pits, stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, in a voice that was no longer his own, he whispered the words that would haunt me forever. "Welcome to Route 13. I don't remember exactly when the car began moving again. All I know is that when it did, everything had changed. The world outside the window was no longer familiar. The road twisted and contorted, and the trees now looked like twisted, skeletal hands reaching for me. The man beside me was gone, his seat empty, but the lingering feeling of his presence remained. The car sped down the road, faster and faster, the engine roaring in my ears. I tried to stop it, tried to pull over, but the wheel wouldn't respond. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, like some kind of nightmare from which there was no escape. And then I saw them, figures standing at the edge of the road, just like the man I had picked up. They were pale, featureless, their eyes empty sockets of darkness, all of them staring at me as I sped past. Their bodies were twisted and misshapen, as though they had been molded from shadows. I screamed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the car refused to stop. It continued down the road, down into the abyss. When I awoke, I was back on Route 13, the same stretch of road where it had all started. The car was still moving, but the road ahead was different now. It seemed to loop back on itself, as if it was a never-ending circle. The trees, the road, the darkness, they were all the same, as if they had reset. I looked beside me, but the man was there again, sitting silently, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight, to escape, but deep down, I knew it was futile. I had become a part of this place, this cursed, endless road where the phantom hitchhiker waits for new souls to trap in his endless loop. I was never going to escape. The distant sound of dripping water echoed through the darkened tunnels as Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the grimy walls. She heard it then, a soft, wet scrape of something moving far too quickly to be human. Her heart froze when a low, guttural growl echoed from the depths, and a pair of yellow eyes gleamed in the dark. It was supposed to be a routine inspection, a quick survey of the city's sewer system to ensure everything was functioning properly. Sarah had done this job for 3 years, navigating the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city with ease. But tonight, as she descended into the darkness, there was a palpable shift in the air. a strange stillness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She glanced around as her boots splashed through the shallow, fetid water that pooled along the sewer floor. The familiar stench of rotting garbage, mildew, and damp concrete was stronger than usual, almost suffocating. The smell clung to the air, thick and oppressive. Her flashlight bobbed in front of her, cutting through the oppressive darkness, revealing only the endless corridors of rusted pipes, cracked concrete, and the ever-present murk that seemed to swallow everything in its wake. Sarah had worked in these sewers long enough to know when something was wrong. There were no signs of human activity down here. No discarded items, no errant graffiti, no sign of the homeless who sometimes took shelter in the deeper, more isolated parts of the system. It was as if the entire underground world had been abandoned. But she wasn't alone. A distant echo reverberated through the tunnels. Something moving, but not quite human. It was a low scrape, like claws dragging across wet stone. Sarah paused, her breath catching in her throat. She'd heard this sound before, deep in the recesses of her memory, from the time she had first begun working here. It had been dismissed as a trick of the mind, a rat or an old pipe creaking. But tonight it felt different. The sound was deliberate, purposeful. "Get a grip, Sarah," she muttered to herself, trying to steady her nerves. "It's probably just a rat or something." But as she continued deeper into the bowels of the city, the sensation of being watched intensified. The air grew colder, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the beam of her flashlight, something that had been waiting, hidden, and patient. The tunnel ahead of her narrowed, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing her closer to the filth and decay. She felt a sudden drop in temperature, a chill that ran down her spine and made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The air tasted sour, almost metallic, and the faint sound of scratching grew louder, closer. Her flashlight flickered again, and as it did, she caught a glimpse of something, a shape, moving just out of reach of the light. It was large, far too large to be any kind of rodent or stray animal. She froze, the beam of light quivering in her trembling hand. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, just as her heart began to pound in her chest, the creature struck. A wet, slithering sound erupted from the darkness, followed by a grotesque growl that echoed off the tunnel walls. Something huge lunged at her from the shadows, something with scales, glistening skin, and a mouth filled with rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth. The creature's body was long and serpentine, its head wide and bulbous, with eyes that gleamed like molten gold in the dark. Sarah stumbled back in sheer panic, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she raised her arms instinctively. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she tried to move, but the air was thick, as if it were pressing against her body, forcing her to stand still, to wait. And then the creature hissed. It was a sound like 100 serpents, wet and guttural, as it advanced toward her with horrifying speed. Its body coiled and twisted as it slithered across the water, its claws scraping against the concrete. The stench of its breath, rank and foul, like the decay of 1,000 corpses, filled her nostrils. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing its rows of glistening, jagged teeth, and for a moment, Sarah was paralyzed by the sheer terror of it. She had never believed the old stories, the ones about the creature lurking in the sewers, the one that people whispered about but no one truly spoke of. But here, in the cold, dark recesses beneath the city, she knew that it was real. The thing had been down here for years, feeding on whatever it could find, rats, the occasional homeless soul, and now her. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Every instinct told her to flee, to get away from this nightmare, but she was rooted in place, paralyzed by the creature's gaze. It was too close now, its hot breath searing the air between them. Without thinking, she spun on her heel and bolted down the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the creature's wet slithering followed her, its claws scraping along the concrete, growing louder with each step. She darted through the tunnels, her breath ragged, her thoughts a blur of terror and instinct. But the sewer system was vast and labyrinthine, a twisting maze of passages that seemed to go on forever. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get out. The thing had been down here for years, feeding on whatever it could find, rats, the occasional homeless soul, and now her. Sarah's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. Every instinct told her to flee, to get away from this nightmare, but she was rooted in place, paralyzed by the creature's gaze. It was too close now, its hot breath searing the air between them. Without thinking, she spun on her heel and bolted down the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the creature's wet slithering followed her, her breath ragged, her thoughts a blur of terror and instinct. But the sewer system was vast and labyrinthine, a twisting maze of passages that seemed to go on forever. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get out. Her feet splashed through the shallow water as she ran, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, as if taunting her, the creature let out another guttural growl, a chilling sound that echoed through the tunnels, reverberating off the walls. She turned another corner, only to be met with a dead end. The walls were smooth, unbroken, the concrete a cold, unforgiving barrier. Panic rose in her chest as she turned to look behind her. The creature was getting closer, its golden eyes gleaming in the darkness, its body coiling as it advanced with horrifying speed. In a final, desperate move, Sarah grabbed a rusty pipe from the ground and swung it toward the creature, but it was no use. The pipe clattered off the creature's thick hide with no effect. It didn't slow down, it didn't even flinch. The creature lunged. The last thing Sarah saw was the creature's mouth opening wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, before everything went black. She awoke in darkness, her body aching, her breath ragged. For a moment, she thought she was dead. But then, she realized with a start, she wasn't alone. The cold water at her feet and the oppressive darkness around her made her pulse race. Slowly, she sat up, her hands trembling as she reached for her flashlight. Her body was bruised and battered, but she was alive. The creature was gone. But as she looked around, she realized something terrifying. The tunnel was not the same. The walls were no longer the familiar, cracked concrete she had come to know. The air was still and stale, the stench of decay thick in her nostrils. The flashlight's beam danced across the walls, revealing strange, scaly marks etched into the stone, as though something had clawed its way through the walls themselves. The growl echoed again. This time, it was closer. The creature had never left. Sarah tried to stand, but the pain in her legs was unbearable. Her head swam as she stumbled to her feet, every instinct telling her to keep moving, to find a way out. But the creature was already there, waiting in the shadows. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching her every move. It had been here for far longer than she could ever know, and now it had claimed her as its next meal. The creature's hunger was insatiable, and in the depths of the sewers, Sarah would join the countless others who had become its prey. In the dark, beneath the city, there was no escape. There was only the creature, forever lurking, waiting, hungry. And it was always watching.